One of the hardest things for beginner filmmakers, I mean the cinematographer and photographer, is knowing the essential camera settings. It's kind of hard sometimes. And to me, if you want to step up your creativity and craft something nice, there are five basic camera settings to run your camera properly. Like if you understand these five basic camera settings, believe me, you can operate any camera in the world and shoot something nice. So that is why I've collaborated with one of the best film academic in the world. If you are a returning viewers, welcome back. And if you are just joining us for the first time, you are welcome. Please don't forget to hit that follow button. I mean the subscribe button. Don't forget, please. Without further ado, let's get into it.
Hey guys, Justice here with tomorrowsfilmmakers.com, the largest online film academy in the world, and today we're going to show you in one single video what takes some filmmakers weeks and sometimes months to learn. We're going to teach you all the basics that you need to know to run your camera properly. Now, when I was starting out, I read books, I took classes, I watched hundreds of YouTube videos, and what I'm about to show you in less than 30 minutes took me months to fully understand. Now, if you watch this video, you will be able to pick up your camera and fully understand exactly how to use it and be confident to get the correct exposure every single time. We're not only going to show you what all of these settings do and how to locate them inside of your camera, but you'll also follow along with us as we have real life examples and we get the correct exposure and show you exactly how to do it. Now, in this video, we're only going to be talking about the basics of running your camera. We are going to go over the 5 major elements of running your camera. If you have a Red camera, a Panasonic, Sony, Canon, whatever it is, these 5 elements are used in all of them. You have frame rate, ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and white balance. Some training videos only focus on one of these and never give you the bigger picture of how all of these work together. And you have to take all of these and then juggle them to get the correct exposure every single time, which is exactly what we're going to be showing you today. Now, first thing you must do is to shoot in manual mode. No matter what camera you have, a DSLR, cell phone, GoPro, if you are shooting in manual mode, your images will actually look better than high-end cameras shooting in auto mode. And I actually know many people that haven't mastered the manual controls on their camera and they choose to shoot auto, which basically means that you tell your camera to decide what to expose for. So set your camera to manual mode and then let's jump right into the first element, which is frame rate. The term frame rate refers to how many frames are in 1 second of your video. So if you shoot something at 30 frames per second, then inside 1 second of footage, there will be 30 frames taken to equal 1 second. Make sense? Pretty self-explanatory. Now, the reason we need to know this is because you should shoot in certain frame rates and avoid others as well. Right now, the industry standard for frame rate is 24 frames per second. This is the most cinematic and is what they use in Hollywood today. It will give you the most natural looking motion that is similar to what our eyes sees. So if you're picking up your camera, shoot in 24 frames per second. Remember whenever The Hobbit decided to come out in 48 frames per second and it was supposed to be like the best thing since sliced bread? Yeah, it failed miserably and nobody liked it because it didn't look like true cinema that we're all used to seeing, but felt more like a home video or something that you would watch on a news broadcast. If you want to have that cinematic look, shoot in 24 frames per second. But what if you want to do slow motion? Because if you try to slow down something that you shot in 24 frames per second, it's going to be really choppy. Now, to get that buttery slow motion look, you need to shoot in 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. But of course, you wouldn't just play these back at normal speed or everything would look like a soap opera. You want to take that clip and slow down the footage and it will be buttery smooth. This is how you achieve slow motion, by shooting clips at a higher frame rate to allow more information whenever you slow them down. So just remember, normal clips 24 frames per second, slow motion 60 to 120 frames per second. So now that we have frame rates out of the way, there are 3 so-called pillars that you have to know in getting the correct exposure. 3 settings that you have to juggle all at once to get the correct exposure on your camera. ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. These three settings all affect the exposure of the image, but will also affect other things as well that you need to be aware of. So instead of just learning one of these, we want to learn all of them at the exact same time so we can show you how to adjust each one to get the correct exposure.
So yeah, I know you are enjoying that video, but please don't forget to like and share these videos to others so them too can benefit from it. And if you have any question, leave them down in the comment section. Now, let's get back to class.
The first setting, and probably the easiest to understand, is ISO. And this is what many people refer to as fake light. This is basically a way to make your image brighter or darker completely digitally. So with this, you are able to turn up the exposure inside your camera regardless of how many lights you have on set or whether it's nighttime or daytime. It's like that little bar on your cell phone that you can move up or down to make your image brighter or darker. Now, ISO is measured on a little bit different scale. It's not like 1 to 20 or something like that. It's usually 100, 125, 160, 200, 250, 320, all the way up to 16,000 and so on. And some cameras can even go up to 200,000 or more. The higher the number, the brighter your image will be. So you're probably thinking, well, this is great, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what I'm shooting outside or how many lights I have. If it's too dark, I simply turn up the ISO and everything's great. Well, ISO does have one major downside, and that is it produces noise and grain into your image. When you boost your ISO, it starts to look like TV static on your image. Now on a picture, this doesn't really look that bad because if you have the ISO super high and you take a picture, it kind of looks like an old vintage style. But in video, the noise will actually move and it looks like genuine TV static inside of your image. So if I put the lens cap on my camera, you can see what I'm talking about. If I have the ISO at 100, which is the lowest it can go, there is no grain, no noise, and it looks like a black image. But as I start to bump up the ISO, you might start to see a little bit of noise and grain. And then whenever I get into the higher ISO numbers, you can really see the noise it's adding. Just imagine this placed over your image. Of course, some of the newer Sony cameras have such good ISO that they hardly have any grain whatsoever. But most cameras tend to get a little noisy starting around 1600 ISO. So the basic rule is ISO does control the exposure, but you want to keep it as low as possible to keep the grain out of your image. That is the first pillar of exposure. The second pillar of exposure is called shutter speed. Now, if you've dabbled in photography at all, you probably know what a shutter speed is. Your shutter speed on your camera is how long your image is exposed to the world. So the sensor inside the camera is what sees the world and captures the image onto the SD card. But there is a shutter in front of the sensor that keeps it from seeing anything. It's almost like the eyelid to your camera. When the shutter opens, it allows the sensor to see an image, and then whenever it closes, that's one picture taken. And that's why on a lot of cameras, whenever they take pictures, you can actually hear the sound of the shutter opening and closing. But depending on how fast the shutter will go up and down, will make your image brighter or darker. So if you have a very slow shutter speed and the shutter opens and stays open for a long time, it's basically letting the sensor see the world and soak in as much light as it possibly can. So if your shutter is open for 4 seconds and closes, the image is going to be beyond bright. But if your shutter opens and closes in a fraction of a second, it doesn't allow the sensor to see very much light at all, resulting in a darker image. That's the basics of shutter speed with photography, but with video, it's pretty much the exact same thing, except it's all done digitally. You're basically affecting how long each of those little 24 frames are exposed to the world. If we have a really slow shutter speed with video, it's going to act like the same thing and allow more light into the camera. And if we have a really fast shutter speed, it's not going to allow much light into the camera, resulting in a darker image. So slower shutter speed is a brighter image, and faster shutter speed is a darker image. But just like with ISO, shutter speed doesn't only change exposure. It also affects something else. When you change the shutter speed, you also affect the motion blur. So let's go back to photography with an actual physical shutter that opens and closes. So say you're taking a picture of a car that's driving past. Well, if you have a really fast shutter speed that's going to literally take a picture in a fraction of a second, it's going to open up, see the car directly in front of the camera, and close. And that's all it's going to see. So there's going to be no motion blur because the camera is actually seeing the car in front of it for a split second. But if you have a really slow shutter speed and the shutter opens, the car drives by, and then it closes again, it's literally going to see the car go from one end of the frame to the other, resulting in a big smear across the frame, which is just a bunch of motion blur. And again, it's the exact same way with video because you're affecting all 24 of those little frames inside of 1 second. So if we're looking at a ceiling fan and we have a really slow shutter speed, as you can see, there's kind of a lot of motion blur. But if we look at the same ceiling fan with a very fast shutter speed, it looks jittery and there's no motion blur. And if we pause both of the images, you can really see what one frame looks like versus the other. On the left, you can see that there's a blur happening and all 24 of those frames look like this. But on the right, with a high shutter speed, all 24 of those frames look like this. Now, many filmmakers have actually used slow and fast shutter speeds to communicate a message to the audience. So if we turn our shutter speed really low to something like 15, you're gonna start to get an image like this. It's very dreamlike and looks strange, and it's completely unusable if you're filming just normal stuff. But if you wanted to use it for maybe a dream sequence, or maybe someone's about to pass out and they can't see properly, all you have to do is turn down your shutter speed. And the opposite is also true. If you crank up your shutter speed to an extremely high level, you will have no motion blur, and you will have something that many people call the Saving Private Ryan effect. If you notice in a lot of war movies, they have that hyper-realistic jittery look, and that's because they've simply cranked up their shutter speed. Whenever they're just talking before the battle starts, everything looks natural and normal, but right whenever the battle starts, everything is super jittery and there is no motion blur. They don't add a special filter or bring a special lens. All they do is simply turn up the shutter speed. Now, there is a rule to shutter speed to get the most natural look, and that is whatever frame rate you are shooting in, you want your shutter speed to be double the frame rate. Now, shutter speed will go up in increments of 10, sometimes 5, but most of the time it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, all the way up to crazy high numbers. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, doubling that would be 48. But since we're only going up in increments of 10, you just want to pick the closest one, which is 50. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, to get the most natural looking motion blur, you would want your shutter speed to be at 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you'd want to be shooting at 1/60th of a second. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you would want your shutter speed to be at 120. Now, that's the rule of thumb with shutter speed because it gives you the most natural looking motion blur, but as rules are, they can also be broken for a purpose. So if you want to give kind of a trippier, weird looking daydream, maybe turn down your shutter speed. Or if you want to give that hyper realistic jittery look, turn up your shutter speed. But if you are wanting to get a natural looking motion blur like this, simply take your frame rate and then double it, and that will be your shutter speed. So, ISO affects the exposure, but can cause noise and grain. Shutter speed also affects the exposure, but can also control motion blur. And the final pillar of your exposure is your aperture. Aperture is what they call the eyeball of your camera. Now, the reason we call it this is because that's kind of really what it is. This isn't inside your camera, but it's inside your lens. The aperture, or the f-stop, regulates how much the lens will open up and how much light will be let into your camera. So if you really think about it, it really is just like the pupil of your eye. When your pupil dilates, they open up and let more light into your eye, and when they close, they let less light into your eye. And that's exactly what the aperture does as well. The aperture will open up to allow more light or close to allow less light into your image. So without changing the ISO or the shutter speed, you can actually dilate the eye of your lens, which will make the image darker or open it up and make the image brighter. And just like with ISO and shutter speed, aperture also affects something else, and that is your depth of field. Now, the depth of field is how blurry the background is. This also means that the amount that is in focus becomes much smaller. So for example, in this shot, I have the aperture at f16. Which means that the lens is very closed and doesn't allow any light into the camera. Now, of course, it's a darker image because I'm not letting a lot of light into the camera, but you can also see that a lot of the background is in focus. But if I have an aperture at f1.4, which means that the lens is opened all the way up, letting tons of light into the image, it's really bright, but the background is also really blurry. So since opening and closing the aperture messes with the exposure, I'm just gonna turn down the ISO on the very bright one and then turn up the ISO on the really dark one just to show you what it's doing. So now that we have the correct exposure for both of them, the one on the left has a very wide open aperture and has a blurry background, while the one on the right doesn't have a blurry background because the aperture is completely closed. So when you change the aperture, you do affect the exposure, but you also make the background more blurry or less blurry. But don't think that a blurry background is something that you don't want. A blurry background makes your image look much more professional and much more cinematic. In fact, the ability to get a blurrier background is what many filmmakers are looking for. And that's why whenever you're buying a lens, you'll notice that if the lens has the ability to open up a lot wider, it's going to be a lot more expensive. But at the same time, just because you have the ability to get a really shallow depth of field doesn't mean that you have to do it all the time. In the Chronicles of Narnia, before the battle starts, there's specific shots that have lower apertures to focus on a single subject, and then there are shots with higher apertures to see the entire battlefield and large groups of people. So use depth of field to aid to your story. So the aperture or f-stop on your lens is measured a little bit differently than you would normally measure something. It goes from f22 all the way down to f5.6, 3, f2.8, and so on. Now, almost all lenses have the ability to go down to at least f5.6. But once you get down to the lower numbers, the lenses are actually going to start to be more expensive, and they're going to keep raising in price as the aperture gets lower and lower. This 50mm prime can stop down to f1.8 and is around $150. This 50mm can stop down just a few more stops to f1.4 and is almost 3 times the price. You pay more money for lenses that have a lower aperture. Now, these are the 3 pillars of getting the correct exposure on your camera, and I'll show you guys exactly how to juggle all 3 of these settings in different situations in just a second, but there is one more setting that is vital to learn as a beginner filmmaker, and that is white balance.
So yeah, I know you are enjoying that video, but please don't forget to like and share these videos to others so them too can benefit from it. And if you have any question, leave them down in the comment section. Now, let's get back to class.
So even if you get the correct exposure, if your white balance is off, your shot is going to be ruined. White balance basically tells your camera what is pure white. If this setting is off, your whites will either look orange or blue, resulting in all other colors to lean in that direction. So if you're dealing with an orange light, you need to be able to tell your camera what kind of light you're dealing with so that it can compensate and make your whites look pure white. Now inside your camera, there are different presets that you can use to get the correct white balance: tungsten, daylight, cloudy, shade, and you can set it to one of these if you're in that situation, and you can even set a custom Kelvin temperature. Now, of course, you may be tempted to just switch it to auto white balance because sometimes outside it can look okay, but that's very dangerous because you're basically telling your camera to make it whatever color it thinks is right. And also, it has the ability to constantly change colors during the scene. Now, the way to fix this is to set your white balance properly so that it doesn't fluctuate. And getting the correct white balance is actually very simple to do. You either, 1, know the Kelvin temperature of the light that you're working with and set your white balance to that, but an even better way, which will guarantee the perfect white balance, is to purchase one of these gray cards off of Amazon for about $7 or $8. You have your subject hold up that gray card in front of the camera, and in your camera settings, you go to custom white balance. And now in Panasonic and Sony cameras, this little box will pop up, and you simply put the box on the gray card, click set, and then boom, your camera will have the perfect white balance. You're basically telling the camera what kind of light you're working with in the scene, and that way it knows the light and knows how to get the perfect skin tones. If you're using a Canon camera, it's almost the exact same, except you just have to take a picture of your gray card. So you could either zoom in or just move the camera to where the gray card is filling the frame. You take a picture, and then in your menu, you go to custom white balance, and it will pull up the last picture that you took, which was that gray card. You click set, and then you will have the perfect white balance. Very simple to do, yet many beginning filmmakers are not doing it. All right, now we know all of the settings that you need to know to get the correct exposure, frame rate, ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and white balance. If you can learn all of those, you can master your camera. Another thing I would suggest everyone to get is an ND filter. It's basically like sunglasses for your camera. Now in certain scenarios, if the scene is really bright, you can't have your lens opened up all the way because it's just letting too much light into the camera. If you put the ND filter in front of your lens, it allows you to open your lens all the way up, even in really bright scenarios. So please, everyone, buy an ND filter. So first, let's take a look at the back of our camera, and I will show you exactly where you can find all of these settings, and then show you real-world examples of us going to different scenarios and changing all of these settings to get the correct exposure. Whatever camera you have, you will have these three numbers: the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. And some cameras have them in different locations, but they will all have these numbers. On my Panasonic GH5S, on the far left of the DSLR is the aperture number, and if you turn this number up or down, it will affect the aperture. And you can usually tell this number pretty easily because it will have a dot in the middle of it. Next to that, we have the shutter speed, and turning that up or down affects the shutter speed. And then the one on the very far right is the ISO. And if you turn that up or down, it will affect the ISO. And many times the ISO number will be labeled with ISO, so it's very easy to see. But what is even more important than all of those is your exposure meter bar. On the back of your DSLR is this meter that goes from -3 to +3 to show you where your exposure is. Now this exposure meter will tell you if you are overexposed or underexposed or perfectly exposed. It is truly a lifesaver. So when looking at an image, if your image is a little too bright, the exposure meter will be too far on the right. If it's too dark, the meter will be towards the left. So whatever direction your exposure meter is, you adjust the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture to bring that exposure meter directly in the middle. So now that we know the settings, we know where they are on the back of our camera, let's go outside and I will show you exactly how to change the exposure and get it correct in real time. So our first setup is outside under a tree. Now the image is way too bright and our white balance is completely off. So we need to juggle all three of these settings to get the correct exposure. First of all, the ISO is set to 1250, so let's bring that down as far as possible, and that turns the ISO down to 100. Now the exposure meter is still a little high and the shutter speed is at 400. So let's double the frame rate and put the shutter back at 50. Now in this scenario, we already have the aperture as low as possible and the ISO as low as possible, yet the image is still too bright. So there's a few things we can do. We can either turn up the shutter speed to get the correct exposure, or we can turn up the aperture until it is properly exposed. This will give us the correct exposure, but will also make our background completely in focus. And to be honest, if I had to choose, I would always turn up the shutter speed before turning up the aperture. But this is where that ND filter comes in and saves the day. It will bring down the exposure so that we don't have to crank up the shutter speed or the aperture in really bright situations. So we put the ND filter on the front of our lens and we have the proper exposure. Next, we have our subject hold up that gray card, we set the white balance, and now we have the correct exposure and white balance to start shooting with. So in these scenarios, if you don't have an ND filter and it is crazy bright outside, the only thing you can really do is crank up the aperture or crank up the shutter speed. If we pick our camera up and go inside with the exact same settings, it's way too dark because it was exposed for the sun outside. So we have to make this image brighter. Now we already have our shutter speed double the frame rate and our aperture as low as it can go, which is f1.8. But I do have a lens that opens up to f1.4, so I'm going to switch to that lens to get more light. So now I have that lens on and it's stopped down to f1.4, which does give us about the perfect exposure. The exposure meter says it could just be the slightest bit brighter, so I'll change my ISO from 100 to 125, and now we have the correct exposure. And as you can see, the ISO is the last thing we changed because that should always be the last thing you mess with. But let's say our lens only stops down to f2.8, and this is the only lens that you have. The only thing you can really do in this situation is add more lights to your scene, or you just have to bump up the ISO a little more until it's correct. In this case, the ISO would be at 500. Then we have the correct exposure. Again, we have our subject hold up the gray card, and now our image looks 1,000 times better than it did before. And then just to do it one more time, let's pick up our camera and go back outside into the sun with the same settings we had before. Our aperture is f2.8, our shutter speed is at 50, and our ISO is at 500, and the image is really bright. So the first thing we're gonna do is bring down the ISO back to 100. Now again, the only two options we have left right now is to either crank up the aperture or crank up the shutter speed to bring down the exposure because it's so bright. And like I said, I will always crank up the shutter speed before I will crank up the aperture. So you can either do one or the other if you don't have an ND filter, but if you do have an ND filter, put that on the front of your lens, which will bring down the exposure and allow you to keep your aperture as wide open as possible and keep your shutter speed double the frame rate. We then get the correct white balance and we have the perfect image. So as you can see, you have to juggle all three of these, the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture to get the correct exposure. And in really bright situations, you want to use an ND filter, which will allow you to get a cinematic shot without having to crank up the shutter speed or crank up the aperture. So I hope that this video has really helped you guys out and you no longer have to search YouTube or blogs or forums to try to learn aperture and shutter speed, but that this one video gave you guys the confidence to be able to get the correct exposure every single time.
Thank you so much for watching that video and see you in the next one.